Welcome back. I know we're all getting excited to start coding, but I want to do one last video before we actually start working with some code, which is the exciting part. But again, I want to emphasize that before we use anything, we need to understand why and why we would need something like Redux. Right now online and with any company that is working with React, most of them have also Redux. So you'll hear React and Redux app mentioned a ton when you're watching tutorials or working with React. And that is because they go really, really well together. Let's just go over a few things about Redux that we want to make sure we learn. And a bit of warning here. Some of the stuff might go over your head or might be a little bit confusing. But I want to show you these slides first because after we go through the Redux coding, we're going to come back to them and make sure that these principles are applied and they make sense to you. So bear with me, trust me, it's all going to make sense by the end. Why do we want to use Redux? As we mentioned before, Redux is really, really good at managing state, especially large state. So Redux is a library that we would want to use if our apps get bigger and bigger and bigger and they have a larger and larger state. Remember, we want to use tools based on the problems that they solve. And Redux solves the problem of what happens when React apps get really, really big and using just this.state just doesn't make sense anymore. It gets more and more complicated. Remember, React is what we call a view layer. It's really good at the view side, but not necessarily at managing state. So use Redux when things get really, really complicated. The second point is useful for sharing data between containers. And this is another thing with when projects become large. When they need to start sharing state between containers. With React, this is actually a little bit difficult and you have to move the state up one layer so that you have a parent that can share state between the two. But with Redux, this becomes really, really easy as we're going to demonstrate in our coding section. And finally, Redux has predictable state management using the three principles. Now, what are the three principles? These three principles in Redux are going to really, really make sense at the end, but I want to still introduce them to you so that we're aware of them. The first one is the idea of single source of truth. And this is a fancy way of saying that we have one single big object that describes the entire state of the app. Remember this? We had one massive state object that describes everything within our app. So we have our single source of truth. Because React reacts based on whatever the state is, we can just have one big object that describes how the app should look, and React will take care of it. The second principle is the idea that state is read-only. And this encourages something called immutability, which is not modifying the object. And it prevents unexpected errors this way. So the state object that we will create with Redux will actually never get modified. And instead, we would create a new state after each action is taken by the user. And then finally, the third principle is the idea that changes are made only using pure functions. Something that we've talked about in my previous course. The idea that a pure function is something that receives an input and always returns an output that is predictable. If we enter the same input 1,000 times, we expect that function to have the same output 1,000 times. Using these principles, Redux has some new words that we're going to introduce in our vocabulary. And we're going to be comfortable with them by the end of this section. The first one is action. An action is something that a user does, such as clicking on a button or a drop-down menu. And what happens in Redux is as soon as a user clicks on something, a button, and creates an action, it goes through something called a reducer. And a reducer is simply a function, a pure function that receives an input, which is the action, so the user just clicked on a button, and creates an output. And this output is the state, or the store, as we call it in Redux, which is the entire state of the app. So as it goes through the function, the store gets updated, and React, because it notices this state change, makes changes to the view layer. Again, these are words that we're going to encounter as we start coding along. Now, why do this? I mean, can we just have an action, and then an action happens, and then we just make changes? I mean, that's how something like jQuery used to work. And yeah, it looks more complicated, doesn't it, adding all these steps beforehand? But as you can see above, if you have tons of actions happening, which with modern apps that are very interactive, this happens a lot, where the user scroll action and then it clicks a button and then highlights something and so on and so forth. You see that the more and more actions we have, the more changes we have to make. And those changes might trigger other actions, which trigger other changes, and so on and so forth. And it can get pretty complicated, as you can see in this diagram. Well, with Redux, we make sure that all the actions go through one reducer. Everything flows through this function. And through this function, it always, because it's pure, returns the same state based on the action and updates the store. And this store now, which represents what our app should look like, makes changes. So it kind of funnels all these actions into one reducer so that everything is predictable and nice. Again, one of those things that's hard to really explain without encountering the problem first, which we'll get to. Now, Redux, and I want to teach this just for historical purposes, uses an architectural pattern called flux pattern. Architecture in software is used as a way to make sure that we're able to solve problems in a logical sense and in an organized fashion. And this flux pattern, which inspired the library Redux, has this idea of having an action and then having a dispatcher that dispatches this action to the store, which is our state, which updates the view. And it's one-way data flow. Everything flows one way. If the view gets updated, we go back to the action and again goes through dispatcher that dispatches the change to the store and then to the view. And this was a pretty revolutionary idea because before that, we had something called MVC, or Model View Controller. And you may have heard of it. It was quite popular. The idea with an MVC pattern is we have an action, and that action is read by a controller. So again, another JavaScript file that looks for actions. User clicks on a button, and based on whatever the controller says, we update the model, or the data in this case. So we can think of it as state. We change something in the model, and then it updates the view. Now, the problem with the MVC pattern is, well, this diagram over here. We have the controller that changes different pieces of the model, and this model can change the view that can trigger another change, and that model can change another part of the view, and so on and so forth. And we have this thing that we saw before. We have the craziness of actions and making changes. All these arrows just crisscrossing and not looking very nice. And although it might not be bad when your apps are smaller, as your apps get bigger, you want to do something like this so it's logical and makes sense. And that's what we want to do with architecture. We want to architect our apps in ways that as they grow, although we may add a few things, in the end, everything is easier to reason about and understand. So we have the flux pattern, which enforces a unidirectional data flow. We have the MVC pattern, which could definitely be improved. If you get anything out of this video, the one thing I want you to understand is the idea that Redux, at the end of the day, is pretty much the same as this.state in React. With Redux, we can replace this.state and theoretically remove all of this.state from React and have it all happen inside of this Redux library, which again, we're going to do. But one caveat. You could technically have Redux with the state, but also still keep a little bit of React state in a component. Redux doesn't replace completely the this.state or this.setState in React. You can still use them together. And I'll show you when you might want to do that, when it's a good decision. But like I said before, without having gone into any of the code of Redux, this might look a little bit overwhelming and confusing. I promise you that we're going to come back to these diagrams and things are going to make sense by the end. Before I throw code onto the screen, I want to make sure that you have some principles and concepts that we're working from. All right, I know what you're thinking. Andre, I am sick and tired of these slides. Even though they have this cool grading color, I need to see some code because I'm getting bored here. Well, you know what? Your prayers have been answered. In the next video, we're finally going to start writing some code and get into some fun things. I'll see you in that one. Bye-bye.